All right. Hey, I'm back. This is episode 6. I did try filming another video between this one and the last, and it went terrible. I only got like quarter of the way through it, and I was running low on time. It was kind of a rush job, and some of my answers just weren't really well fleshed out. Like I hadn't improved on them since the first video, so here I am back again with another video. I put a PowerPoint together for this one. It's a little more in depth, a little more wordy than the PowerPoint from the first one, for the first exam practice. So, it'll help me answer some of these questions a little bit. And I can just reference it. And, no, I just like setting up, I don't know, setting up the PowerPoint is also just another way to help, I think, study a little bit. Just trying to pick what information is good to put on a slide that'll help answer a question. So, I still did, work a little MS Paint in there. So, there should be some fun with that. But yeah, I'm probably just gonna get started here. I don't have a huge load of time today, but I should have enough to get through this, and yeah, and using the PowerPoint as well. So, uh, yeah, I guess 1 week till the exam now. So there's some things I feel pretty strong with, feel pretty comfortable with. There's a couple others where I'm still, not 100% on. We got a couple of group study sessions set up for next week with the class, so that'll be good. I think that'll help. Just sure anything up I can ask, if there's anything that I'm kind of struggling with. But outside of that, not a whole lot to report on this front. But yeah, I'm just gonna get started and start ripping through this. Ripping's kind of an exaggeration, but getting through this. There we go. Got the logo up again. Like I said in the first video, I do like this logo a lot. I don't know what it is. I know it doesn't scream multiple use. It's it's definitely more of a resource first use, but it looks cool. That's all I gotta say about that. All right. So in terms of the ability of federal land agencies to authorize and restrict mining activities on federal public lands, how does the General Mining Law of 1872 differ from the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920? So, General Mining Law of 1872, it gives prospectors a right to mine on non-withdrawn federal lands that have not been reacquired. And the specific quote is any citizen of domestic corporation to enter the public lands for the purpose of prospecting for minerals. So, it gives that right of exploration to any U.S. citizen or person who intends to become a citizen. Fix my hair a little bit. Got to look good for the law study guide video. No. And then the General Mining Law, it only pertains to locatable minerals today. Originally it pertained to mostly everything except coal, I think. But locatable minerals, so yeah, that's your gold, silver, copper, lithium, and it just goes on. And I'll share some of the ones that it doesn't cover with the Leasing Act. No permit or license required. The miner's only required to do, last I found it said they're only required to do they're only required to pay like $125 fee to hold their claim every year. And I think it used to be where you can, you had to show you did $100 worth of work every year, but then I think they just changed it so you can just pay the fee. So you really don't even have to you don't really necessarily have to do work. Anyways, it's very minimal to hold a claim, an unpatented claim, to maintain it. It's that security of tenure, and claims can be held indefinitely with or without mineral production. And there is some stuff about that that can be challenged if you're not producing minerals on a claim by an agency. So that also, that ability to hold a claim for relatively pretty cheap allows, someone, a miner or a company to, to acquire, stake a claim and then hold it for cheap and maybe, hold off on extracting the minerals until the market becomes more favorable. So it allows for a little bit of speculation. Is that I don't know if that's the right, I think that's, I don't know, speculation, but yep. Or just market improvement. Prior to 1995, so I'm not going to go into depth on this because this is one of those things I got down on lock, like this especially just this specific clause. But yeah, claims could be patented for either $2.50 an acre or $5 per acre, based off those 1872 land prices. And that's, 1 year moratorium since 1995. It's not in play. However, there are like patents that had been, or claims for patents that had been placed before the moratorium started are still being processed, or were still being processed after that date, if they met certain requirements. Yeah, I guess, yeah, it applies only to public domain lands that have been held by the federal government since they became a part of the U.S. Kind of already covered that earlier in the question. So I'll just kind of move on to the mineral, and this is just kind of some of the broad strokes, the major differences between the two. Obviously, if you want to get to the nitty gritty, there's definitely a lot more to dig into, no pun intended. Mineral Leasing Act of 1920, so it only covers leasable minerals, and this is oil, gas, oil shale, phosphates, sodium, and certain other minerals. Yeah, so there's not that right of like exploration, no federal, no citizen of the U.S. can go out and just exploratorily start drilling for oil on public land. And also, see, the government has discretionary power to open up lands, for for lease for lease for oil production or oil, these leases. So the government has discretion on where this can take place on their federal lands. And the government still retains ownership of the federal lands that are leased for mineral rights. And with the unpatented claims, the government still does retain ownership. The only thing that the unpatented claim, the miner is getting, is the exclusive right to the mineral on his claim. And then these, leases, the mineral leases require payments of rent, royalties, and a payment of a reclamation bond as well. So there's money going back to the government, there's money going back to the public, and then there's also an assurance that land is going to be, reclaimed post production of the oil or gas or what have you. So yeah, like I said earlier, the agencies have the discretion to make lands open or closed for development, and then this will be determined in their land use plans, their RMPs. The money's collected from royalties and shared with the states. The money that's collected was kind of covered that. Royalties typically hover around, I think, like 12.5% is what I saw, but it varies. It's not. I don't think it's fixed at 1%. At a certain percentage. Describe one common explanation as to why the General Mining Law of 1872 has been so resistant to change over the years. Are you in favor of modernizing this law? If so, explain how you would do so, explicitly making reference to parts of the 1872 law you would like to change. So I do have a slide that this one will come back into play later, but it also pertains here as well. So I guess like one of the big things that we talked about in class and then in the textbook about why this law has been so resistant to change is special interest groups and public choice theory. So yes, the agency capture will, also plays a part in it too, I guess, but it's more this. I think this referred to as the iron triangle. So essentially, we got these special interest groups, and then we got Congress, and then we got our agency, we got the Department of Interior, your bureaucracies, the Department of Interior, USDA in this corner. So anyways, these interest groups, they provide electoral support, campaign donations, stuff like that to Congress. Congress then gives funding and political support to the bureaucracies, and the bureaucracies they provide maybe they lower regulations and special favors for these interest groups, because essentially the bureaucracies they answer to Congress. So maybe if these agencies want that little bit of funding or political support from Congress, they're going to want to appease them, make these right public choice or certain choices about policy and execution of these of certain things that appeases Congress, and Congress wants to appease these interest groups who are providing electoral support as well, so they may give some friendly legislation, oversight, all that, and then these interest groups, they want this lower regulation and special favors from the agencies, like the Bureau, the Department of Interior, USDA. I guess essentially why the regulation hasn't changed more so has to do with just the interest group and Congress relationship. I think that's more of why the GML hasn't changed as much. It's more directly tied with just this portion here, Congress and special interest groups, lobbying and electoral support, and campaign donations, and the return that those mining, maybe it's a big mining association, National Mining Association, or big mining companies, can provide a lot of money, And so they don't want that GML to change. It's pretty favorable, subsidizes them a little bit. So Congress pays them a favor with some friendly legislation and oversight. I don't know if I explained that great, but yeah. It's a law from 1872, so I think there's definitely room for improvement. So I'm in favor of some making some change and reforming it for sure. I think switching it to the lease system, making these minerals locatable minerals, putting them in the leasable umbrella, I think would be a big step to gaining that getting some money back to the federal government for these minerals or for to lease that land, and then also with those implementing royalties too, so you're getting money back to the public for the harvest of their minerals, and also like that reclamation bond as well, I think would be as big like that, because that's required with the leasables, that having that assurance that the land is going to be reclaimed, or that money's put in place for that land to be reclaimed post mining operation. And now they like reclamation bond like go beyond the general mining law, like in FLIPMA there is and under the plan of operations requirement, reclamation bonds are required. So yes, there are. I mean, reclamation bonds are required for mining. Mining claims that have been established under the GML. They still have to do that, but it's not required by the GML. So maybe some sort of environmental protection, through a reclamation bond in the GML would be a big, I think, a good, addition to it. And another thing, I seen in the reading was that currently the GML, doesn't require any sort of like data collection on mineral production from mining companies. So the BML, the BLM, Forest Service, they have no collection, no data collection on mineral production for these locatable minerals. They do for leasable minerals, but not for locatable. So the proposal would just kind of be for producers to report their production volumes and and values. And then this would be good for, if say we did implement that royalty, they could change, that could fluctuate with increases in production, decreases in production, or, and in values as well. So I think, if we were going to do a royalty, I think that would be good, because I think that would also, like, that one would be good for both. I think it would also benefit the mining company if we were to implement royalties, to have these so that we could adjust royalties with production and and values, so so that we can maybe the value of the minerals have dropped down, or maybe they're hit, its production's slowing, it's, I don't know, we can adjust the royalty so it doesn't. So I think that would be good for both the producers and consumers of minerals. And also that data collection could be used to determine if a posted reclamation bond is adequate, or if it needs to be adjusted as well. Another way it could also, maybe if they're not producing as much minerals, and so then maybe they could, the reclamation bond could be smaller. They might get a little money back, I guess. I don't know if that. I'm not sure about that. I thought it, and then I said it, and I was like, I don't know if that makes sense, but I think it could potentially. In terms of royalties, revenue returned to the federal government, how does the Mineral Leasing Act differ from the General Mining Law of 1872? So we've kind of covered this one quite a bit already. Mineral Leasing Act of 1920 requires royalties to be paid by the leaseholder. Requires royalties to be paid by the leaseholder to the federal government. So it's based on market value of the mineral, or price received at sale. So it will change, as that price of a mineral, oil drops or goes up. And I guess, like I said, I got here again, typically 12.5%. I don't know. For some reason, I'm thinking maybe I just pulled that number out of thin air or something. I mean, I know I read it, and it was definitely, but I don't know. Anyway, GML, no royalty requirements on profits, no money paid to the government for taking and selling minerals from public land. So there's no royalties with the GML. What is an in-holding? What is an in-holding? This is one I could have done a slide with. I don't need to, but I don't know. I like having the slides. It's kind of fun. Fun making them. That was a lame sentence. That was kind of a sorry sentence. Fun making PowerPoint slides. Anyway, What is an inholding found on public land, and what do they have to do with the old patent provision that used to be part of the 1872 General Mining Law? So, inholdings are tracts of patented private land held within larger areas of federal public lands. So, I guess like thinking back to the railroad grants, you had that checkerboard pattern, or even like the homestead, land grants, where you maybe would have, a section of railroad or homesteaded land in the middle of like maybe, and then maybe it's surrounded by public land or vice versa. But essentially, these inholdings are these sections of patented private land within, typically like in the context of this, they're within, large chunks of BLM or Forest Service land, where you'll have these little, and they can be kind of, they can be the shape of a claim, so they might be irregularly shaped. They're not a quarter section or a section or anything like that. They can be, weird, just the claim boundaries. And it's private land, it's fully privatized land. It doesn't just have to be used for mining. That ties into the GML because I briefly mentioned earlier, us prior to 1995, these mining claims after 5 years could be patented. They could be, like you could apply for it to be patented, and then you would just pay if your application for patent, went through successfully, you proved it, you met the requirements for it to be patented, then you would pay either $2.50 per acre or $5 per acre, depending if it was a placer or a load claim. So way below. I mean, yeah, that value, those prices were set in 1872, and they were still active until 1995. So they were way below market value. Can't even. I mean, even today it would be vastly more extreme because 1995 was about 30 years ago. So yeah, that's scary. 1995 was 30 years ago. Okay. And anyways, like I said, the claimant becomes owner. Once once that claim goes through, they get the patent approved. They become the private owner. That land's theirs. It's private land. No longer belongs to the federal government, and they are free to do whatever they want. They can. They don't have to mine on it. They don't have to show that they're mining. It's theirs. Because with the unpatented claims, you do have to show that you can only use it for mining. On an unpatented claim, you can't like build a garage to store your four-wheeler or something side by side. Who knows? It has to be used for mining. I mean, I guess you could maybe make the argument that, I don't know. I don't know. Could a state government impose some type of reasonable regulation on a developer of a proposed mine under the 1872 General Mining Law? Would such a regulation be automatically preempted under the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution? Please explain with an example. So, the case I kind of went for, the example I went with on this one was the People versus Reinhardt, a relatively pretty recent case, but essentially, 2009, California places a moratorium on gold dredging in waterways, statewide moratorium, and that it extends to federal lands as well within California. Essentially, then in 2012, this guy Reinhardt, he's charged for having and operating a dredge on federal land. Reinhardt objected the charges and challenged that the GML would preempt the California state moratorium on dredging. California Supreme Court, though, determined that the Mining Act did not regulate mining methods, but the allocation of claims, unlike the moratorium, which just regulated a specific equipment or specific type of mining. The California regulation only prohibits the use of dredging for mining in rivers and streams, does not prohibit other types of mining throughout the state. So essentially they would, it kind of like states that the GML would preempt state regulations if the state regulations outright banned mining, banned mining statewide. And then, and the California Supreme Court also, cited that the GML still defers to state and local law in its language. With that, there's like that line in there with state, territorial, and local regulations, kind of referring to like how you can mine, but you have to still do this. So the GML still does defer to other regulations, local regulations in its framework. And then the California Supreme Court also cited the Woodruff case, which was the California ban on hydraulic mining. kind of a pretty similar deal to this. And in that case, it cited similar evidence against the GML or against GML preemption over state environmental regulation. It did briefly touch on this Granite Rock precedent, and I guess they kind of avoided it because I think essentially what it seems like now. I think this is kind of beyond the scope of this question, but Granite Rock established this commercial and practicability test, where if a state regulation makes mining economically unfeasible, it would be an effective ban on mining, and then the GML would preempt state regulation. But even so, like the California Supreme Court kind of stated was like the California state dredging moratorium only regulates dredging, a specific type of mining. It doesn't outright ban mining. It doesn't make mining as a whole economically unfeasible in California. And then, they also cited that, I don't know if this was part of the Grand Rock precedent, but they also stated, like, the moratorium on dredging, is not severe enough to the point, if the dredging was severe enough to the point where, mining on federal lands would be impractical, then I guess it would be considered a land use plan. So I guess that ties in with the last part I just discussed. And so then, if it was considered a land use plan, making that mining impractical, then the state regulations would be preempted by FLIPMA or NIFMA on federal lands. The GML does not automatically preempt a reasonable regulation placed on a mining claim, as they found in this case. It would preempt regulations that would completely prohibit mining by making it economically infeasible. Or if they were if they were considered a land planning. I guess that kind of is saying the same thing there. Very basically, what are two ways that federal public lands could be withdrawn from mineral entry under the 1872 General Mining Law? So this is a pretty quick one here, but number one, they could be withdrawn through the legislative. Congress can withdraw lands by statute. I need just a couple examples here. The Wilderness Act of 1964, when that was originally passed, Congress had designated certain areas that would be wilderness areas that would be withdrawn from mining. And then there's also like Mining in the Parks Act of 1976, which closed parks and monuments that had been previously open open to location, but they were closed. Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 68. Public land, specifically looking at like the wild river designations, those like public land within those is closed to mineral entry, and that's just a few examples. There's quite a bit more where they've pulled these lands out of entry under the GML. However, it is stated, I think, in the book, and then also, in lecture we talked about how if like patented claims that were even maybe like unpatented claims that were already there prior to the passing of these acts can still be operated. I don't think they can't expand beyond their boundaries, but they can still operate on their claim. And then then a second way that lands can be withdrawn from mineral entry is through the executive, presidential executive order, through the Antiquities Act of 2006 can withdraw lands from mineral entry, and then Congress or the Secretary of Interior through FLIPMA, Section 204 of FLIPMA, can also withdraw lands from mineral entry. However, that section of 204 of FLIPMA does have some requirements. There's a 20 years, then they must be they are only good for 20 years, and then they must be renewed. And then there's also like an emergency withdrawal that goes to 3 years. And then there are like some other stipulations in there as well. That break these down a little bit more, but those are kind of the two like biggest things coming from those Section 204 of FLIPMA, Secretary of Interior withdrawals. With sufficient detail, describe two widespread and often repeated criticisms of the General Mining Law of 1872. So number one here, I just got right off the bat, lack of royalties. So in the Leasing Act, like I mentioned earlier, the Leasing Act of 1920, royalties are charged on the profits of minerals mined, and then the revenue is shared with the state and put towards land reclamation funds. The GML doesn't require royalties to be paid on minerals sold, and by not charging royalties on profits from the harvest of minerals, the government is also kind of subsidizing the mining industry. It's seen as subsidizing the mining industry, which is kind of another, it's definitely a criticism that the heavy subsidy to the mining industry. And yeah, and I guess to further the argument, the public technically, the public owns those minerals on federal public lands. So they, the argument is that the general public should get a little bit of a cut, even if they aren't, going out there doing the hard work and, mining and putting in the high upfront costs of a mining operation and prospecting, exploring. They are harvesting those minerals from federal public lands. There should be maybe a little bit of dispersal for that, especially with like the reclamation. Maybe having a reclamation fund that is, supplied by a royalty is kind of a strong argument. And then the lack of environmental protections in the GML itself. Like I mentioned earlier, FLPMA, NIFMA, NEPA, all these other acts that have been put in post the GML do offer environmental protections and environmental regulation protections for federal public lands, but the GML has none in its framework. So yeah, and especially like it mentions the the cleaning up and reclamation of abandoned mines, kind of big one here. There's apparently, according to I think it was the CRS document, there's about 500,000 abandoned mines sites here in the U.S. alone, and a lot of these abandoned mines, the companies abandoned, they closed up shop. They've been gone for 100 years, so there's no one to hold liable for them anymore. So it's like, there's what do we do about those? And I guess that kind of ties in with the first part. Having that reclamation fund that's supplied by royalties. Maybe having something in putting in a reclamation, a specific reclamation regulation, or in the in a new statute, or changing the GML to include some sort of reclamation clause would be a big thing. Or even I did also see this in like a Senate hearing for proposals to reform, like having a Good Samaritan Act, or Good Samaritan clause in a potential new act or reform to the GML, because organizations are pretty hesitant to go and clean up and try to clean up these abandoned mine sites, because they are there's no protections for them. So say they go and clean it up and then something happens, they're liable, I guess, to be sued then. So it's maybe putting in some sort of a Good Samaritan protection for other organizations to come in and clean up, and maybe at least take some potential for them to be litigated out of the equation. Yeah, I think that kind of covers that. With sufficient detail, describe two arguments that are made in favor of retaining the General Mining Law of 1872. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I guess number one here I got is the right to enter the public domain and prospect. All valuable mineral deposits in public lands belong to the United States. Are free and open to exploration to citizens of the United States. That I skipped some lines, but those are kind of the big broad strokes there. And like the mining industry, officials argue that restricting this free access by making it maybe a lease-based system or something like that would that elimination of self-initiation would curtail exploration efforts. It would drop down. Mining in the U.S. might drop by curtailing those exploration efforts, and it could prevent and dissuade mining exploration altogether. And they cite that hard rock mining mineral exploration requires a lot of effort, time, covering lots of land. And a lot of expense. It's high cost. To go out and explore for minerals. It's not there's no sure thing. So that would definitely be that's one pretty good argument. Big argument to retaining the GML, or at least that part of the GML. And then that also kind of ties in with this other one I got here, which is maintaining a stable critical mineral supply, or building up a critical mineral supply, I guess, supply chain. Because they're critical minerals, essential to the economic and national security of the U.S., supply chain, which is vulnerable to disruption, and serve an essential function in the manufacture of a product, absence which would have significant consequences for our economy or our national security. So the industry, they argue that the subsidies provided by the GML, incentivizes mining companies to explore and process critical minerals, to sustain that critical supply chain, or potentially open it up more as well. The GML subsidy, yeah, they ensure stability in the supply chain, and then also the lack of royalties as well, keeps them, wanting them to keep their mining operation here and keep the domestic supply of critical minerals intact. Yeah, and then like I said, it also just third one I kind of did here too. That the GML incentivizes, incentivizes and subsidizes and keeps the U.S. Competitive, mining industry competitive in the in mineral production globally. If the U.S. was to adopt royalties or regulations, they wouldn't be able to compete with other countries that don't have royalties or regulations, or as much at least as the U.S. may potentially if they were to leave the GML. So this would could raise the cost of production and raise the cost of the product, and then mining companies altogether might just leave the U.S. and go start operations somewhere else where it's less money for them to operate, easier for them to operate. Can the U.S. Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management regulate mining on the federal lands it manages? If so, what specific law or regulation could it use to do so? Can the U.S. Forest Service or the BLM categorically say no to a proposed hard rock mine to be located on lands not withdrawn from mineral entry? Why is this a tricky question? And he did also say that you could choose the BLM or the Forest Service when answering this, so I just went with the BLM, just keeping in trend with what we've been doing so far. But yeah, so FLTMA, in 1976, statute, land planning statute for the BLM's Organic Act, even though, it was, I guess, like 30 years late. But anyway, provides a hook. In managing the public lands, the Secretary shall, by regulation or otherwise, take any action necessary to prevent unnecessary or undue degradation. So, with this, the BLM, prevents, the 3809 rules come out, regulations come out pursuant to preventing unnecessary or undue degradation as a result of mining on federal public lands. Essentially, these 3809 rules just lay out how a miner prevents unnecessary or undue degradation, because the thing is, take any action necessary to prevent unnecessary or undue degradation. Well, mining will, like, degradation, is going to be, as a result of mining, is either going to be necessary or due. I don't think you can do mining without having some necessary or due degradation of the land. But they have these rules to prevent unnecessary or undue regulation as a result of mining. And these are, like I said, the 3809 rules. And yeah, these are just, regulations put forth by the BLM pursuant to FLTMA, pursuant to that clause in FLTMA, the unnecessary undue degradation clause. And essentially, first, it kind of requires a plan of operations for non-casual use mining operations. Includes reclamation planning. The operator must provide financial guarantee. The plan undergoes NEPA analysis. The plan of operations will undergo NEPA. And then, also consulted with other acts such as the ESA, like that. And then there's also some performance standards as well required in 3809, Section 420. And and then I didn't go into the performance standards, but it does have performance standards relating to mining in there as well. I don't think I have a slide for this. I should, but I don't. Okay. No, I do actually. Hold up. Yeah, okay. But we got the BLM, FLTMA, unnecessary undue degradation clause, 3809 rules. So here's the unnecessary undue degradation clause, 3809 rules prevent unnecessary undue degradation in the mining process. And then here I even got, granted land degradation may be necessary or due in mining, so they are limited. These 309 rules are limited, or the BLM's limited by this clause too, though. They're limited in what they can do, how they can regulate. But requires a plan of operations for approval before non-casual use mining can begin. And then the performance standards, I guess I just kind of got briefly summarized, but there's like technology, land use plans, mitigation, reclamation, waste disposal, what must be included in in reclamation, leach containment, air and water standards that also must be maintained. So the BLM has these 3809 rules. However, yeah, so that they do have that is how they can kind of manage mining, at least regulate mining on federal lands. However, the BLM cannot outright just say no and prevent mining, prevent a person from exploring and mining in the the federal public domain on unwithdrawn lands. The BLM can. I mean, it's tricky because they can kind of they can kick the can down the road a little bit though with these 3809 rules and the plan of operations, because the BLM can they can deny a plan of operations and therefore the mining can't start. So then they'll deny a plan of operations. Oh, you got to go back to the drawing board on this. Yep. Yeah, we don't like the look of that. I think that might, that plan of operations, there might be some unnecessary or undue degradation caused. That just doesn't quite fit in the 3809s. So they can do that. They can kind of kick the can down the road a little bit, but they can't just outright say no. Oh, here we go. I'll go back to this slide now. Okay. What is meant by the term agency capture? So, I guess I got a little diagram back here, although you can't really see that on the camera very well. I don't know. I haven't messed with the camera much. But anyway, so agency capture, here in my little simple answer, is agencies work in a narrower field than the legislator. So there's more of a concentration and influence of the special interests can be greater. And these special interests focus time and actually I'm going to go off this. I like this better. So we got powerful corporations, interest groups. This can be mining. In this case, in the case we're talking about, it's going to be mining companies, maybe grazing, big ranchers, or timber companies. And these companies, these corporations, interest groups can use tactics such as lobbying, financial contribution, lucrative job offers towards the regulatory agency personnel. So in this case, Forest Service or BLM personnel. So these lobbying, financial contributions, lucrative job offers towards the agency personnel might make the agency then favor the industry interests on that public land over the national interests. And when they favor these agency interests, that maybe kind of leads to industry interests are going to be more in line with lax enforcement of regulations or even weakened protections and policies. So I guess an example of this I got of agency capture, although there wasn't a bunch of evidence, it was just mentioned in a video I saw, but was the 2008 recession, how financial and bank regulation failed due to the influence from banks they were supposed to be regulating. Yeah, and they maybe they employed tactics such as lobbying, financial contribution, lucrative job offers. And I should say, I do always just say, mining, grazing, timber. I guess it could be, it could be possible, maybe if there was a big, a big, I don't know, recreation-focused company who was, here, I don't know why, I always paint, I shouldn't just paint mining companies, grazing, ranchers or timber companies out to be the bad guys, because that's not true at all. And I don't know, that's just always the example I go with, but maybe say there was, an area with a big ski resort or something, I guess, or a big outfitter. I don't know, a big outfitting company might, maybe maybe put them in this position, and they use these tactics towards the agency personnel, and they get their interests, So I'm not trying to take too much of a side or pit someone as bad, because this, it's not just limited to mining, grazing, and timber companies. What is, okay, okay, a little bit of a reiterated, but what is meant by the term agency capture? Please explain the term by making reference to either mining, mineral leasing, or rangeland law and management. See text for discussion of capture. How can citizen suits and or judicial review provisions provide a check and balance on captured agencies? So I guess for this one, I did use rangeland law and management. And then, okay, so section 3, I might have a slide for this one as well. I don't know. Nope. Okay, this kind of has some of it on here. But anyways, so FLTMA has section 309, which requires, is the advisory council clause, which requires 10 to 15 locals in the land use planning to, yeah, so 10 to 15 locals have to be involved and included in land use planning, which, to me does seem like a good thing because they are locals. They know that land, so I think they should be included in the land use planning. And even in the Tailored Grazing Act, they had an original grazing advisory boards, made up of locals, and that I think it was heavier handed instead of these just advisory boards today. But even though so, like it's 10 to 15 locals working in close proximity with I think it's yeah they furnish advice to the secretary with respect to land use planning, classification, retention, management, and the disposal of public lands within an area. So this statutory formed group, but it's they're that local, so they're probably going to have maybe more interests that are focused on the local area. It might be grazing. I'm slipping back into what I was just kind of going against in the last one, but it could be grazing or some sort mining or timber harvest. Probably not mining, but maybe. And yeah, so so this council works closely with the agency, and they to make the decisions about management planning. And so I think that that definitely has potential for agency capture then, because they're working close. They're, who knows what's going on, exchanges. There might be some contributions, lobbying. Yeah. So I think that, and over time, and the influence, the advisory council, the BLM, they might become captured and make favorable decisions towards the wills of this advisory council of 10 to 15. And then I guess, okay, so like how can citizen suits or judicial review provisions provide a check and balance on captured agencies? So, we got this case, Sierra Club versus Hardin. Big timber sale in the Tongass National Forest, like at least 8 billion board feet. I guess it's like a 50-year sale. But essentially, the APA has a provision that states a person suffering legal wrong because of agency action are adversely affected or aggrieved by agency action within the meaning of a relevant statute is entitled to judicial review thereof. So, the Sierra Club then they seek standing to in order to litigate to challenge this timber sale in the Tongass National Forest. So they had to meet in order to meet standing. They had to meet to have standing in order to challenge the timber sale. Because they did find that the Forest Service had violated a lot when executing this sale. But it was more about how did they have standing, and how did they have standing to challenge this captured agency. So the court held that one seeking standing under this provision must meet two tests. He must show that the challenged action has caused injury, in fact, economic or otherwise, and the interest sought to be protected must be arguably within the zone of interest protected or regulated by a statute or constitutional guarantee. So then the court, in this case, determined that it's generally accepted that the type of injury which will support standing to sue in the public interest need not be economic. Sue in the public interest does not have to be economic, but may be aesthetic, conservational, or recreational. So based on that gives them, that kind of checks the box on the first part of the standing, in order for one to seek standing under the APA provision of someone suffering legal wrong. Then the second part, under the circumstances of this case, Sierra Club and the Sitka Conservation Society have standing to assert the aesthetic, conservational, and recreation interests of local members and users who are directly affected by the timber sale and proposed pulp mill complex. So then they met the second part by having, because there was on my other sheet I had it written down, but also in the case it's like, the Sierra Club has 500. They had a group of members in, I think Juneau was the closest city, but then they some of those members regularly. Man, I've been doing this too much, I think. But anyway, some of those members had been regularly, using that area too. But there was also members within close proximity, and then it went back to another case, or cited another case in San Francisco. I'm going down a rabbit hole, but so that they had standing under the judicial review clause of the APA. They just had to meet those two criteria in order to do so, and that was determined that the injury had been determined because could also be extended to aesthetic and recreational values. And then they had the reason was it close proximity or the arguably within the zone of interest, and they had members of their organization in that zone of interest. I think that's I'm not like I tried to stop into his office hours, but he was busy, or he was gone. He was out of town. But that's one I wouldn't mind asking about because I'm not sure if that's exactly answering the question how he wants it to. What does it mean when someone says that a hard rock mining claim or federal land grazing permit or timber sale is a subsidy? These are referred to as subsidies because the cost to mine or graze on federal public lands is comparably cheaper than it would be on private land. And then I just got some quick figures, quick numbers here. So the BLM and Forest Service grazing fees is a minimum of $1.35 per AUM, and the highest it's ever been is $2.31 per AUM. State lands grazing fees typically range from $1.35 per AUM to $80 per AUM, and the private land grazing fees typically range from $8 per AUM to $23 per AUM. And it should be also noted though that it's stated in the stuff in the book and stuff that typically the BLM grazing fees are relatively poorer quality, but still yes, they're considered a subsidy. Like all of these are, the timber sales are, they're selling the sales are being sold at a cheaper rate than they would be from private. And then hard rock mining claims, they're paying a very low rate to maintain their claim. So that's why they're considered a subsidy, and it's very affordable, and it almost incentivizes people to do that on the land at that rate. They are also contending though with other people using that land as well. So there's some give and take, I think. But it's considered a subsidy because it's generally quite a bit cheaper than it would be to do it on private or state. What is a grazing fee on federal lands, and why is there so much controversy about this issue? So grazing fees were established under the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934, and essentially they were just supposed to be a reasonable fee to cover the charge for managing the range. Takes place, those things come out in the heart of the Great Depression. You got the Dust Bowl kicking off, so it's and there was definitely wanting to manage these lands maybe a little more, get that money and maybe manage these lands, recover them a bit, save them a little bit. And it was just a price to be paid by the leaseholder and charged on a per animal unit month AUM basis. Then then by 1976, I think I do got 1976. FLTMA comes out, and there's a provision in there which is that states to FLTMA is kind of put in place to achieve a more fair market value for the use of public lands. So they're taking a look at the grazing fees because I don't have the numbers for it, but they were very cheap. I mean, they were very cheap under the Taylor Grazing Act. So FLTMA essentially wanted to attain more of a fair market value for these use of their public lands. And so they put a moratorium on raising or on changing the price of the AUM for a couple of years, and then they come out with PREA in 1978, which essentially it establishes a grazing fee equation, which is based on the cost to graze on private land, the cost of production, and the price of the market, the cattle market. So they take those variables in, and then that's how they calculate the grazing fees. And like I said, I think the highest it's ever been since 1978, was $2.31 per AUM, and the minimum is $1.35 and per AUM, and it's been that I think for at least the past 5 years, if not longer. Let's see. Oh, controversy. Yeah, there's this kind of ties in with the last question, but these grazing fees are often seen as a subsidy to ranchers from the government, and they've been historically low and are currently much lower than the cost to lease private land or state land. And also, big thing is, the BLM and Forest Service, generally spend way more money on managing their rangelands than they do get from these grazing fees. And I think I got a figure here from 2017 that from the CRS that states that $79 million were appropriated to the BLM for range management, and the BLM collected $18.3 million that year in grazing fees. I think the number's a bit, I don't know, I think that statement's a bit weird, because I guess, when $79 million appropriated for rangeland management, it's not just saying grazing management. So I don't know, like, because I don't think was that 70. I don't know if that $79 million is direct, just for the benefit of cattle producers. I mean, I would assume it, if by managing those rangelands, even for cattle producers, they're still going to benefit the multiple uses of the land as well. So I don't know. I don't know if I think that statement's a bit weird. I mean, yeah, obviously they're not getting their money back on these grazing fees, but I don't know if it's not like the rangelands are just used for grazing though. So I think that I don't know. That's why I think that statement's a bit odd. Maybe I'm just missing something there. What is a grazing fee on federal lands, and why is there so much controversy about the issue? What guidance do federal range laws provide regarding grazing fees on BLM lands? Be sure to include relevant provisions from the federal land from FLPMA and the PREA. So yeah, like I said, grazing fees established under the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934. Reasonable fee meant to just cover the the cost to manage rangelands. So I guess under the Taylor Grazing Act, okay, yeah, to cover a fee, okay, back up just a second. So under the Taylor Grazing Act, it's a fee, a reasonable fee to cover the cost of administering the range. So I guess in my last argument, theoretically, yes, the money the fees should cover the cost of administering the range. So maybe that is okay. Maybe there's some statutory reason is that the controversy of the huge disparity between collections. Anyway, price paid by the leaseholder, charged per AUM. And then calculated by the PREA formula I had mentioned earlier. And yeah, the BLM and Forest Service also, they charge the same fee for grazing. Yeah, they both, yeah. Although the Forest Service does some goofy stuff. They don't use AUMs for some reason. They use, I don't know. Yeah, that's stupid. Forest Service nonsense, but I don't know why they wouldn't use AUMs, but okay. Gotta be different, I guess. Anyway, controversy. The grazing fees are often viewed as a subsidy. BLM and Forest Service vastly spend way more money administering the range than they are getting from revenue of grazing fees. Grazing fees are and currently have been much lower, or historically and currently are much lower than the cost to lease private or state land for grazing. And then, I guess, kind of looking at the language, FLPMA, like I mentioned earlier, has that thing, that clause stating that the U.S. should receive fair market value for the use of their public lands. And then they placed that moratorium on fee increases until the Forest Service and BLM could determine what fees would be equitable to both the Treasury and those who held permits. So then following that, a couple years later, you got PREA. And the PREA, essentially, Congress legislates a formula to calculate grazing fees. Its base value of $1.23 per AUM, and then adjusts, like I mentioned earlier, for private grazing fees, cattle prices, and the cost of production of cattle. And so it fluctuates, and the minimum is $1.35 per AUM that can be charged. The Taylor Grazing Act of 1934 includes a provision stating that the Secretary of Interior shall manage public lands pending their final disposal. How did the Federal Land Policy Management Act change this provision? So over here we got Taylor Grazing. I don't think you can see this. For some reason it looks fuzzy on the thing. But anyway, Taylor Grazing Act of 1934. And it has the clause, promote the highest use of public lands pending its final disposal. So, FLPMA comes out in 1976 and states that the public lands be retained in federal ownership. And kind of establishes that final disposal as being in the federal government's hands. That's all that question asks for, I think. It's the next one that kind of builds into it. And I even got that in the flow chart here a bit. All right, what is a common theme found in the past or present versions of the Sagebrush Rebellion? How does a central tenet of this movement challenge the pervasive theme found in federal law that public lands be managed and conserved in the national interest? So, big theme really kicks off with FLPMA in 1976. And the clause that we just mentioned in the last question, the public lands be retained in federal ownership. And essentially, like I said, establishes that that final disposal is in the federal government's hands. A lot of people, when PREA came, or the Taylor Grazing Act, sorry, came out in 1934, they read that promote the highest use of public lands pending its final disposal. They read that final disposal and they're like, okay, so I'm going to get one of these Taylor Grazing Act leases. I'm going to hold on to it, but there's that clause in there that's, leaving the door open for this land to be disposed of. This is going to get, this is going to get sold eventually. I'm going to be able to buy this. I'm going to get this claim. I'm going to get this land. But then FLTMA comes out in 1976 and closes the door on that, slams the door in their face, and says, "No, we're going to keep the land. Yeah, it's ours." So yeah, kind of common theme then. That builds off. Then you also got Kleppe versus New Mexico in 1976, and then you got a series of a big series of environmental laws and regulations in the early 70s. So it kind of builds up, and then the FLTMA in '76 happens, and that kind of triggers this Sagebrush Rebellion, and that's just built on the idea of that loss of local control over federal lands, and the wanting a transfer of lands to state, and then also in FLTMA of 1976, in that section 102 that has the public lands be retained in federal ownership, there's also another clause that states, the national interest will be best realized if the public lands and their resources are periodically and systematically inventoried and their present and future uses projected through a land use planning process. So that national interest clause really kind of tears open that hope for local control and opens it up to national interest. So displacing the public local interest with the national interest, and that really kind of that's kind of the heart of the Sagebrush Rebellion, or at least the initial run. So yeah, this would establish that no more lands would be disposed of, and recognize that the national interest in public lands will be considered when determining what the land should be used for. So this shifts from the preferred use of federal public lands by locals to the multiple use of the national interest. And the Sagebrush Rebels want federal lands transferred to the state or private, and are more in favor of local management of these lands. And I guess like in lecture he did point out the other day that it's like there were some because the grazing rates, I guess even at the time the grazing rates were very low on those federal lands, so it's like some of those ranchers maybe didn't want because then if they went to the state they'd be paying a higher rate, because the state manages those state trust lands. Those state lands are managed in order to earn revenue for their beneficiaries. So essentially though, the Sagebrush Rebellion is just based on the idea that there would be less concern for their local interests when doing land use planning, and more concern for the multiple use interests of the national population, and that also that the loss of the chance that land's going to be disposed of to them. Describe the multiple use mandate as found in FLTMA. How much management discretion does it provide to the Bureau of Land Management? What do resource management plans, as required by FLTMA and NEPA, have to do with multiple use? Let me read that. What do RMPs, as required by FLTMA and NEPA, have to do with multiple use? Provide an example in your answer. So I think I definitely kind of went into here. So multiple use, FLTMA section 102 essentially states that the Secretary SOI needs to use and develop or use and observe the principles of multiple use and sustained yield in development and revision of land use plans. And then section 103 defines multiple use as management of the public lands and their various resources so they're utilized in a common. Actually, I have this up on the board, don't I? So it lays out a pretty big definition of what multiple use is, but like some of the big lines are management of the public lands and their resource values so they are utilized in combination that will best meet the present and future needs of the American people. And there's it goes through here, making the most judicious use of the land, for renewable and non-renewable resources, recreation, range, timber, minerals, watershed, wildlife, fish, natural, scenic, artificial, or scenic, historical, without values, without permanent impairment of the productivity of the land, quality of the environment, and not necessarily to the combination of uses that will give the greatest economic return or greatest unit output. So there's like, it's a broad statement, but it offers, through that, it offers quite a wide range of, discretion to the BLM, just depending on what you read. Because, I could just read making the most judicious use of the land. Like that, you can take that, one way. Or you could read renewable and non-renewable resources, range, timber minerals, watershed. There's stuff in here. Like, it just depends at what angle you want to come at it from, multiple use from. You can pull it out of here, it seems. It's just really broad. And even in in NRDC versus Hodel in 1985, the courts they reiterate this. They say they're taught in reference to Flipma and Priya. They're like they state, quote, they are general clauses and phrases which can hardly be considered concrete limits on agency discretion. Breathes discretion at every pore, end quote. So it's breathes discretion at every pore is a pretty good summarizing statement for the multiple use mandate of Flipma. It's very broad. There's no I don't know. It's not like there's no substantive. I don't know. There's just no forcing. I don't think on there. So BLM kind of relied on. Oh, and then I guess moving into the next part, which is kind of I think this is more in reference to how. Or this kind of references the discretion, and how NEPA comes into play, and resource management plans and NEPA kind of come into play with the multiple use. So you got the comb wash allotment case, which, anyway, BLM, they authorized grazing in this comb wash allotment. However, they had only for the area prepared a programmatic EIS and an RMP, for the San Juan resource area. But they used that programmatic EIS and the RMP in order to authorize grazing on a comb wash allotment. Anyways, the argument goes to court over or it's brought to court over the fact that the comb wash allotment, or the lack of site specific considerations for the comb wash allotment prior to authorizing grazing. And essentially, so it's found that the courts find that BLM did violate Section 302 of Flipma by authorizing grazing without engaging in reasoned and informed decision making. No allotment management plan, no site specific EIS. The BLM didn't show that they had balanced the competing resource values. So they had violated NEPA when permitting grazing too in the Comb Wash Canyon. So essentially, the judge says, the BLM violated Flipma by failing to make reasoned and informed decision making that the benefits of grazing in the canyon outweigh the cost. So essentially, and there's even another case, Sierra Club versus Butts, where it states, multiple use principle requires that the values be informedly and rationally taken to place. So this discretion, this offers a lot of discretion, breathes discretion at every pore, but the agencies do need to show that they made that, when deciding what multiple use they're going to use for a land, essentially the main stipulation is they need to comply with NEPA in selecting that, that multiple use, and they need to show they can show that through NEPA that they've made that decision in a reasoned and informed way. So that's kind of the main, I guess, hold on how they can be prevented from having just unlimited discretion in multiple use, in the multiple use framework. Because if the BLM had prepared a site-specific EIS and shown that they had made that reasoned and informed decision-making, and that grazing in the comb wash was in the best interest by weighing against other interests, they wouldn't have been in violation of Flipma or NEPA, and would have therefore had the discretion to apply whatever multiple use they feel is in the best interest. I feel like that's probably the best I've explained that so far while doing these, and I still don't think it was very good. Anyway, why is the multiple use mandate given to the BLM and U.S. Forest Service so discretionary? Multiple use mandate, Secretary shall manage public lands under the principles of multiple use and sustained yield. Multiple use has got a long and broad definition, as seen here. It's got lots of different clauses that can be read from different angles as a way of backing your goal, I guess. Yeah. But and then also the interpretation and definition of multiple use has also changed with shifting executive offices, so it changes a lot too, the definitions of what some of this stuff means. So it's changing. There's a lot of moving parts with it as well, and it offers up a large, like I kind of stated a bunch already, but it offers up a large list of potential land uses and state that they must they must be balanced in land management processes. And essentially, like the last question stated, was like they're pretty much an agency's open to using their land, however whatever multiple use they feel, as long as they make a reasoned and informed decision, or show that they were reasoned and informed in their decision to use that multiple use on that land, or that multiple use was in the best interest for that land. Multiple use, according to the Federal Land Policy Act, is defined as, it's right there, not going to read that, mouth's dry as heck. This room must just be super dry, I guess, I don't know. The BLM's new FLPMA regulations state that conservation is on par with other uses of the public lands under FLPMA's Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act, or Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Framework. Do you believe that BLM's interpretation of multiple use in this proposed regulation is lawful, or does it exceed the agency's statutory authority under FLPMA? In other words, does it go too far? Please explain, making a reference to agency discretion and the court's interpretation of multiple use. So I think I might, okay, here we go. So BLM, using statutory authority from FLPMA to establish they're trying to establish conservation as a use on par with other uses. So, and they cite in their regulation, this is, kind of as a direct result, direct response to climate change, and the conservation definition from the proposed regulation is, management of natural resources to promote protection and restoration. Our overarching purpose of the rule is to help facilitate the use of conservation to support ecosystem resilience, including a new tool in restoration and mitigation leases. So I think that's kind of a big one. The restoration and mitigation leases, the tool of those to meet this objective. Conservation is a use, and the protection and restoration are tools to achieve conservation. And then the conservation rule also recognizes areas of critical environmental concern and how they contribute to ecosystem resilience. And and they even say in there, ASEX designation can be used to protect landscape intactness and habitat connectivity. So it also emphasizes the use of ASEX as well. Is this a lawful interpretation of multiple use by the BLM? So I kind of went back to the case Perkins versus Bergland, and in this case, the courts found that the multiple use language, such as that which will best meet the needs of the American people and making the most judicious use of the land, to be barely limits on agency discretion. And I go back to the quote they even quoted early. They brought up the quote again. Multiple use breathes discretion at every pore, and then they kind of state that the courts aren't at liberty to break the tie by choosing one theory of range management as superior to another. Does this extend to conservation as a multiple use? Yes, at least in my opinion, yes. Of answering this question, yes, as long as the BLM implements conservation as a multiple use in a reasoned, and when they do implement it, and they do it in a reasoned and informed manner, with a NEPA analysis. And kind of going back into that last case, the comb wash allotment case, as long as they show that they came into a reasoned and informed manner, that conservation was in the best interest for that land, then I think it is within the multiple use framework. And like the court said in Perkins versus Bergland, there's hardly any limits on discretion in the multiple use language. So I do think it fits within that. I think, describe two provisions found in FLIPMA that can be used to advocate for or achieve conservation-oriented outcomes on public lands. So there's, FLIPMA Section 202, Part C, number 3, give priority to the designation and protection of areas of critical environmental concern. So the ACEC clause of Section 202, which essentially, establishes areas within public lands where special management attention is required to protect and prevent irreparable damage to important historic, cultural, scenic values, fish and wildlife resources, and or other natural systems or processes, or to protect life and safety from natural hazards. So essentially, while drafting a resource management plan, they identified these areas of areas of critical environmental concern, and then in the plan, they provide these areas with certain protections to ensure that their values aren't damaged. So this might limit particular uses within that area. And even here, you can't see it on the camera, but it was literally just the other day when we talked about this in lecture. I was just scrolling through. I was just on the computer and it came up. But anyway, this Lauren Boebert versus Gunnison sage grouse, and essentially, apparently, there were some ASECs being. I think they're going into effect. Areas of critical concern in Colorado that were identified in order to protect these Gunnison sage grouse, which I think they're endangered. I'm not 100%, or they're threatened at least. And, on these ASECs, they limit oil and gas leasing activities. And I guess, so yeah, I saw that because I don't know, apparently that Lauren Boebert was, she made some statement about it. I don't really care about that. I'm just stating that there were some ASECs, as an example, ASECs put in place in Colorado that limited oil and gas leasing activities in response to, these Gunnison sage grouse habitat. That's kind of one example of how those ASECs are put into effect. I don't know why I just changed slides. I don't need to. But yeah, they may limit the allowed uses in an area. And then my second one I went with here from FLIPMA that kind of can be used to achieve or advocate for conservation-oriented outcomes was Section 202, Part C, number 7, which just states, weigh the long-term benefits to the public against the short-term benefits. So, maybe when drafting a management plan for a given area, this forces the agency to look at potential long-term effects of certain management decisions. So maybe when they're designated an area that could potentially be opened up for grazing lease or an oil and gas lease, they might need to consider, the short-term benefits toward, for the lessees versus the long-term benefits to the greater public, which might desire, how can that affect the multiple uses down the line to the greater public? So I don't know if it's a super definitive, but I think it could be used to advocate for a conservation-oriented outcome. I think it could be used to argue that for sure. Not as strong as the ASEC, but ASEC clause, but still. Federal Land Policy and Management Act's unnecessary or undue degradation provision. How has this statutory provision been used in the past in the context of hard rock mining on federal lands? So the unnecessary undue degradation, provision. Like I mentioned earlier, we had the 3809 rules. Wrong way. Yes, we had the 3809 rules. Like I said, these do, currently place, regulations on mines in order to prevent unnecessary and undue degradation on federal lands. However, the Clinton administration, and their midnight 3809 rules, I don't know. But anyway, they changed the definition for unnecessary undue degradation to include conditions, activities, practices that result in substantial irreparable harm to the values of the public land that cannot be mitigated. So this definitely it gave the BLM more discretion to prohibit mining operations that would otherwise be in compliance with relevant environmental laws. If the BLM determined it broke the new definition, it gave the BLM, this change gave the BLM more discretion. However, this was repealed shortly after by the Bush administration. But yeah, like I said, currently, it's used to prevent unnecessary and undue degradation. But yeah, at that point, with the Clinton admin, the change definitely gave a lot more discretion to preventing mining. common statement made by the courts when reviewing either FLIPMA or MUSA is the multiple use mandate breathes discretion at every pore. What is meant by this statement? So breathes discretion at every pore, it means that the courts mean that the multiple use mandates only offer a broad and general phrases expressing concern and desire for the environment. The mandates offer a lot of discretion. A lot of discretion to the agencies in the planning process for land use. And I got NRDC versus Hodel. The courts don't have a say over how the agency manages for multiple use. They only have say if the agency came to that management decision in an arbitrary or capricious way, i.e., they made the lack of reasoned or informed decision making. So essentially, if an agency makes reasoned and informed decision making or uses reasoned and informed decision making in their selection of a multiple use for a land, then the courts really can't do much. They're pretty limited in the scope of their review. What is the primary purpose of the National Forests under the U.S. Forest Service 1897 Organic Act? So, this is, it's based heavily off Gifford Pinchot's wise use philosophy, but essentially the three big takeaways are, improve and protect forests, securing favorable conditions for water flows, and providing a continuous supply of timber. And that was kind of the big one. And then also, it was mentioned in the reading how there was the Forest Reserves Act in 1891, which allowed presidents to reserve forest lands. And I guess Grover Cleveland, up until the Organic Act was passed, was just he was going kid in a candy store, just you get a forest, you get a national forest, you get a national. He was just going nuts with it. So they passed, they wrote, I think they kind of also, it's in the book, it kind of seems like they passed this Organic Act, not only for those first three things, which are very important, but also to rope in that Forest Reserves Act power a little bit as well. Briefly stated, how did the conflict over the Bitterroot and or Monongahela National Forest lead to reform of National Forest Law and the passage of NIFMA? Describe one detailed provision of NIFMA for illustration. So, I wonder if I did that. Oh, yeah, I did. Okay. Yeah, Monongahela National Forest. So it's, essentially it was the challenging of, there were 3 timber sales in the Monongahela, and, the rule, the argument was that the Forest Service had violated sales provision in language of they had violated the Organic Act, that, that said that trees could only be sold and cut if they're dead, mature, or of large growth, and may be sold only when the sale serves the purpose of preserving and promoting the younger growth of timber on the national forest. And essentially what it came down to was the Forest Service had interpreted large growth as, on the stand level, a large growth, a large stand, they essentially kind of, determined. Whereas, the courts determined it as, no, large growth means, it's a big tree. And so essentially what this did was, and they also, the Forest Service also wasn't marking timber, which is directly required in the Organic Act, timber to be marked before it's, harvested. So they weren't doing that, which was just a straight up violation of it. Instead of the large growth, but anyway. And as a result, though, of this case was an effective ban on clear cutting throughout the U.S. And all national forests just banned clear cutting. And as Congress then has to kind of respond to this, and that's what they want to limit the reliance on clear cutting, and kind of fix the problem here. So they tackle it, they pass, and that's kind of where NIFMA comes in. And NIFMA is established to regulate and establish standards for land resource management plans, provides the framework for our LRMPs that all national forests must have. And essentially there's my particular section here, NIFMA section 6 is the clear cutting provision. And this essentially just states that, clear cutting, all the even age, regeneration methods, seed tree, shelter wood, clear cutting, they're limited, and it provides only, when they can be applied. And for clear cutting in particular, it states, for clear cutting, it is determined to be the optimum method. And for other cuts, it is determined to be appropriate to meet the objectives and requirements of the relevant land management plan. So, it doesn't ban clear cutting, but it limits clear cutting to being used only when it's the optimum method of harvest. Which, that, compared to previous acts, that's a pretty big one. I don't know if I got anything in here for that. Okay, I guess I got a little bit. I don't think it applies. Oh, here's 6 and 6. Yeah, clear cutting only when it's the optimum method of harvest. So that's kind of that section 6 of NEPA, big one for at least regulating clear cutting on national forest, and definitely kind of a direct result of the Monongahela. But then it was also, yeah, like the Bitterroot case was also very big. I could throw a picture of that on here too. Some of those clear cuts that they were going down. All right, let's see. Oh, what are the most significant ways that NIFMA has constrained the amount of discretion the U.S. Forest Service had under the 1897 Organic Act and the MUSIA of 1960? Please be sure to discuss the issue of wildlife somewhere in your response. So essentially, NIFMA of 1976 requires each national forest or national grassland to write a land resource management plan. And these land resource management plans are kind of a 3-tiered regulatory approach. So, yeah, kind of moving on here. So here's the 3-tiered regulatory approach. So, tier 1, you got your national NIFMA regulations that govern the development of forest level plans. You got your forest level plans, which regulate activities within a forest area, and provide long-term goals and desired conditions. And then you got your site-specific projects within your national forest under NIFMA and must be consistent with the forest plan. So over here you kind of got, the whole national forest system. And then here this is just the Kootenai National Forest, northwest Montana, Lincoln County. And then, within the Kootenai National Forest, you got these management areas and zones where they have, certain management requirements that must be met within those zones. Prescriptions are zoning ordinances, essentially, kind of. But anyway, and then, each tier, so these site-specific projects have to be consistent with the forest level plans, and the forest level plans have to be consistent with the NIFMA regulations. So it's, everything has to be, because there's also the plan consistency provision, which I'll go into in a further question. And, just shows, like, you have these, going from national forest level, site specific, and then has to be consistent with each previous tier. Yeah. And then also, I think that's on the last slide. And then, also NIFMA has this, first, not in the Organic Act, not in MUSIA, but in NIFMA, you got the wildlife diversity mandate, which essentially is a substantive and enforceable requirement for the Forest Service, that hadn't been previously found in. Lost the remote. Anyway. Okay. But not previously found in the Organic Act or MUSIA. And it, it states that, in a plan, it should provide for the diversity of plant and animal communities based on the suitability and capability of the specific land or area in order to meet the overall multiple use objectives. So, this one, they have, it forces, it's a substantial enforcement requirement for the Forest Service to provide for that diversity of animals and plants. That hadn't been found in previous acts. And then I also got Section 6H of NIFMA, which also states that the Secretary of Ag, has to appoint a committee of scientists who weren't U.S. Forest Service employees to provide technical and scientific information on proposed guidelines and procedures. And this even led to further regulations that require maintenance of habitat to ensure viable populations of a species within an area. So it built on that wildlife mandate as well. But broadly, NIFMA requires forest, land resource management plans, and, it also requires that wildlife diversity mandate, which were two big changes from the previous major acts of the Forest Service. How does the concept of multiple use differ from NIFMA's wildlife diversity mandates in terms of agency discretion, flexibility, and enforcement? be sure to reference the wildlife diversity / viability and the role of the courts in your answer. So yeah, anyway, NIFMA's wildlife diversity mandate. It's an obligation for the Forest Service for conserving fish and wildlife in NIFMA forest planning requirements. It's enforceable and substantive. Forest Service constraint. For the Forest Service constraint on their management activities. And it requires that forest plans provide for that diversity of plant and animal communities. And so courts still have courts have still deferred to agency discretion when managing for wildlife diversity as long as methods ensure population viability, which goes back to that viable population regulation that had been made, or not, I guess I don't know about made, but provided by that the committee. And there's the Sierra Club versus Merida case, which was in 2 national forests in Wisconsin. But essentially, the Sierra Club challenged, the RMP of these 2 forests, and on the basis that they had failed to use conservation biology and planning to maintain biological diversity. And I think conservation biology is essentially stating that like a large landscape that's connected can maintain maintains higher biodiversity or higher diversity than small or isolated sections of habitat. But anyway, the court ruled that the Forest Service still complied with NIFMA statutes and regulatory mandates, plus NEPA, and essentially stated, conservation biology is not a necessary element of diversity analysis, insofar as the regulations do not dictate that the service analyze diversity in any specific way. So there's still discretion to the agency if, in how they analyze diversity. And how they manage for wildlife diversity or plant and animal diversity. So there's still some discretion, but the agency still has to consider wildlife. There's just discretion as to how they analyze that that diversity mandate. And then the Multiple Use Sustainable Yield Act. There was the U.S. Forest Service had some responsibility to consider fish and wildlife in national forests. But there was no requirement to conserve wildlife in any specific way. Just consider wildlife and fish in the multiple use decision making. I think as seen in the multiple use mandate, it's just it's briefly mentioned, and lots of discretion in multiple use decision making. As seen in the Perkins versus Berglund case earlier. Okay, let's see. Land and resource management plans, forest plans prepared by the Forest Service. What is the National Forest NIFMA's plan consistency provision? So we go back here. Essentially, what the plan consistency provision states is that all resource plans, permits, contracts, and other instruments, essentially these site-specific projects have to comply with the forest level plans. And the forest level plans have to comply with the NIFMA regulations, and then there's also the NIFMA statutory regulations that also. So there's I guess it's 3 tiers, but you could do a 4th tier even with the NIFMA statutory regulations or statute level, law. But essentially the provision, plan consistency provision, it states that there has to be consistency from the bottom to the top, So you can't diverge. Your site-specific projects can't be different or they can't go and align differently than your forest level plans. They have to be consistent with the forest level plan. Then the forest level plan has to be consistent with the NIFMA regulations, and the NIFMA regulations have to be consistent with the NIFMA statutory laws. Tiering. All right. What are management area designations / zones as found in the land and resource management plans, i.e. forest plans, prepared by the Forest Service in accordance with NIFMA? So management area and zones, I kind of have on here, you can't really see it at all, but they're within a national forest, so they're within a forest level plan, and they, did I make another? No, I didn't. Okay, I didn't make another slide for those. But anyway, they're required for approval of an LRMP, a forest plan, and their area prescriptions kind of applying to the future activities in that management area. their resource integration and minimum specific management requirements for that area. So there'll be stipulations as to what can happen in that area, or what's the goal and how is that goal going to be achieved in that area. Or like I hear like zoning ordinances under which future decisions are made. They're like stipulations on what can occur in that area, and yeah, they had to be consistent with the forest level plan. But yeah, and then I guess I should have mentioned with the last one is like, yeah, these forest level plans are kind of like, I got over here, and this is also where NEPA, like these have forest level plans have to be NEPA compliant per NIFMA, and these forest level plans also act as a gateway that these site specific projects have to get through. So, pretty big deal. Describe 2 ways total that the NIFMA imposed legal constraints on timber harvesting and provided protection to wildlife on national forest. So I might go back this one. So, yeah, I mean, I guess first part here, I just went with the wildlife diversity mandate section, which essentially states that they have to provide for diversity of plant and animal communities. When doing the land, when making these land resource management plans, and then that's kind of a direct legal constraint imposed on the national forest, in regards to wildlife. But then you also got you got your section 6, which it provides, or 6, especially 6 part E, which provides timber harvests only occur where and then it provides a list of things that where your timber harvest can occur. So it places requirements on timber harvest, and especially like the clear cutting provision, like I had mentioned earlier. So I'll just kind of run through like 6E. Timber harvests only occur where adequately restocked in 5 years. Protection for water sources. Selection of a harvest system, not solely because it will offer greatest economic return. Direct stipulations for clear cutting or other even age regen methods. And then also, it has that non-U.S. Forest Service science group, to be formed in order to assist and inform on proposed procedures and guidelines. Also provides something, a clause about standard mean annual increment of growth reached before harvest. So there, it definitely breaks it down and provides some actual legal constraints on what can be on timber harvest. And then you got your wildlife diversity mandate, which requires wildlife plant and animal diversity to be maintained as well. And that's the last question. So yeah, I kind of went all the way through. There's still a few few on there I'm not 100% feeling great on, but I got a little bit of time yet, so I'm gonna try to lock in on those and get some of the stuff down. But yeah, I like having the PowerPoint. It makes it a little more engaging, I guess, too, to have something to refer to and point at. But yeah, I think I'm gonna wrap it up. So yeah, hour and a half, so long one. So yep, bye. Thanks.